So as time goes on, more and more Europeans are coming and settling into the New World. Um, and I already briefly talked a little about the Spanish and the missions. They're happening in the Southwest, where it's very controversial nowadays. Well, I mean, it's controversial for a while, but I know it's become more publicly controversial as we talk about, were the missions really a place of refuge for the Native Americans under Junipero Serra, or were they places of coercion and non-freedom? In other words, were Native Americans who had converted were called neophytes. Were they allowed freedom of mobility, or were they basically stuck there as forced labor? That's a big debate within indigenous studies and early U.S. history. But definitely it wasn't ideal, especially as the Spanish slowly were starting to move across the Southwest territory. So that's kind of the Spanish Catholic system, the 70s missions. Whereas the English basically were sending out missionaries, figures that went out and ministered to Native Americans. In the big scheme of things, the Christian missionary movement didn't have much success overall when it comes to converting Native Americans in general. I mean, they had some success, but in the long run, there's even today, if you think about like the numbers of people who are identify as Christian, Native Americans tend not to be ones you would typically think of. Now, um, as I mentioned in the other lecture, a lot of the English that are settling identify as Calvinists. They're Puritans, and they're basically creating this Calvinist oasis here in the colonies. Now, two figures stand out as as two people who were like basically kicked out of these areas. One is Roger Williams, who will eventually move up to Rhode Island. And Roger Williams is kind of seen as a pioneer of Baptist theology and thinking, especially on the in the language of separation of church and state. He actually believes in religious freedom. And in general, he had a much better relationship with the Narragansetts, these Native American tribe that was there. Then there's Anne Hutchinson, a woman who believed that she had basically received a special calling by God through the Holy Spirit. That was obviously a no-no back in those days, especially as we're moving the age of witch trials, or actually the heightened of witch trials in the 17th century, not just here in the U.S. but also in Europe. Actually, a lot worse in Europe. Um, and she was involved with what's called the antinomian controversy, because she basically, as a woman, is saying God's speaking to her. There's a section in your textbook where you see the trial done against her, and it's very typical. That God wouldn't be speaking to this woman. She's given the boot and eventually dies outside of the town. Um, Finally, another person who is important if you think about first. A settler, and as kind of the founding figure of Pennsylvania. He's also the Quaker Oats guy, but more importantly, Pennsylvania becomes a refuge for Quakers. So already early on, we're getting this sense of like the New World being this Protestant kind of a working hypothesis of the spread of different types of Protestantism. And they were called Quakers, also called the Society of Friends. They're called Quakers because they would shake when they got a kind of a prophetic word from God. And it's a very democratic based type of community when it comes to like God and stuff. Very different from like the kind of Calvinist hierarchy you see in around Massachusetts, for example. Okay. The other thing down here, I just have it referenced that even Christianized Native Americans would oftentimes be hunted and attacked by English mercenaries. So I'm not really going to say much more about that. All right. So yeah. Okay. Great. So we're not obviously doing this for the class, but I do think it's important that you know your English, your 13 colonies, and just review this within your book, um, and just kind of get a good grasp on what the first 13 colonies were. And again, I kind of referenced this already. It honestly, to some extent, to me, it's not as big a deal as the history books. Like, get so obsessed with this. In some ways, I think what is really, I mean, obviously, it's interesting. About 20 people die because they're accused of being witches, and it looks like there was a lot of pandemonium involved, and where the accusations came from. But if you look at the bigger scheme of global history, the witch trials and witch hunting in Europe it just blows the U.S. out of the water. In fact, what's kind of crazy about this story is the people involved, or their children, especially, like within the mid to early 18th century, were pretty honest about being wrong about what they did. At least some of the major leaders, they realized they did a big oops, which sounds horrible, but there wasn't, there's this mythos, like, thousands of quote unquote witches were being hunted in the U.S. It's nonsense. It just wasn't there. If anything, it's kind of seen with Anne Hutchinson in this story. You put them together, what you do see is elements of a greater attack on women's influence and power within the communities. So historians on women's history have at least convinced me that if you look at the late Middle Ages, so we're talking 1300s to 1500s, um, that there was little oversight on what the villages were doing, and women had some pretty strong influence over communities as healers and mystics, or whatever. Um, and same thing, Native American groups, women also could yield different social political influence. Um, but as you move into actually the 17th century, there's maybe late 16th century, but definitely 17th century, you do get this kind of, it just seems like a kind of coercive effort by the growing governmental powers. And what I mean by that is, when you're looking at this time period, you are really looking at the beginning of European nation state, and then thus by extension European colonies. So now you're having a much more developed political philosophy and statecraft, way more hands-on attention to the people. And so that's where you really start to see this persecution of women just within the European worldview happen. And so this, to me, seems like an extension of that of that trend. Okay. I did skip one thing, and let me just quickly go back there. And you should definitely read this about it in your textbook. Probably say a little bit more about it. But Bacon's Rebellion happened in 1676. Now, this is like the real first true uprising among the servants within the colonies. And one of the things that happened was, a lot of people make a big deal of it because you have like African slaves and indentured European servants rallying together and fighting against the government. And one of the things that happens is this uprising actually does target Native Americans. So that's why I tend not to be like, yay, it's such an awesome event, because you have this like popular uprising, because the violence does extend over to the Native Americans. What eventually does come out of out of Bacon's Rebellion, though, is the fact that I think the powers that be are very concerned about how both African slaves and white indentured servants basically join forces in this moment. And so there's where you start to see the separation between the indentured servants and African slaves. So you're starting to see the greater differentiation between like, oh, you're African, you're a slave, you're on a lower hierarchy. Spain, if you want to again bring back Spain, because Spain's actually thought about this a little bit more, especially Spanish in Latin America. They've already kind of created this caste system of hierarchy based on race and mixedness. Now, the thing with the U.S. colonies, the British don't really mix with their Africans. I mean, well, they do later, but I don't mean they within like an actual like multicultural, multi-ethnic community. There's really no sense of that happening here. Whereas in Latin America, there's a really more greater sense of that, and so that's why they address it through their like caste system. Whereas in U.S., not so much. Okay, so finally, you have the first major like conflict that I look at the 7 Years' War, or oftentimes known as the French and Indian War. I look at it as more of the setup for the American Revolution, right? So if you look, the end of the war is 1763, and American Revolution starts around 1775, 1776. But all that Stamp Act, tea tax, etc., that's all happening in the mid to late 1760s and early 1770s. So the lead up to the American Revolution begins with the 7 Years' War. The other thing about the 7 Years' War is basically now you have the two major up and coming European powers, Britain and France, going toe to toe. And it's really kind of the first global war because they're not just fighting at home on European soil, they're fighting here in the Americas on, so they're fighting on the colonies. They're also fighting in the Middle East, and they'll be doing that, as time goes on. Because Britain and France are, constantly at each other's throat in the next couple of centuries until 20th century. But the British want to keep expanding. The French have a better relationship with the Native Americans, and so the British pushing for expansion, as we've already saw in the last lecture, not doing so hot with Native Americans in general. French are actually a lot better at this, and this will lead to the two sides going to war, and generally the Native Americans mostly go on the side of the French. And again, a lot of the times the old time squabbles has led to other Native Americans joining the British. This is when George Washington first pops up in history, and actually he pops up as a loser. He has a small group of men and is actually defeated at Fort Necessity. Anyways, the war drags on. The British will eventually win, and the Peace of Paris basically grants that the French are out. They now will basically yield this territory to the British. In fact, it'll be later on they regain the territory from the Spanish and then sell it to Jefferson. That's another story for another day. But now the balance of power goes to the British, and you really do see the rise of the British crown in the next, 100 or so years. And so what happens is this sparks a couple of things. Well, first of all, the Native Americans who had joined, they joined him, and they're kind of like, great, we're on the losing side of this. And so this leads to a rebellion by a guy named Pontiac and a number of Native Americans. And this forced the British to kind of come to the table with Native Americans. And so this leads to this map here, where you have this line that's drawn that separates the 13 colonies from quote unquote Indian Reserve. This is proclamation line. So this is one of the first things that leads to conflict with the English colonists here to the English state, because there's already a push to go west in the colonist mindset. And they fought this war with the British, against the French. And now they have been like told, you can't cross this line. You have to like let the Native Americans have this territory. And so this will be cause number one for the English colonists to want to rebel against the British.